If you haven't seen IDM or if you don't know what IDM is, like that's the whole point of this show, right? IDM is based on the upstream project called Free IPA, and it's basically like an Active Directory style identity domain for your Linux systems. And I've talked about this a lot. We haven't touched a lot on IDM on into the terminal because it is decidedly not terminally, right? You're looking at it right here. But I have done a bunch of other content about IDM. There's a lot of really cool features that I'm not going to dive into today because we're trying to just touch on these things. But I did want to show you a really quick demo. Look, I've got some users, and you can see here I've got a bunch of users already defined. I've also got hosts, right? So this gives you this concept of how hosts and users are both in this domain, and then, of course, you can do things with the hosts and the users to permit access. These users can access these hosts. Or there's under policy here, there's sections for pseudo rules, which I don't have any defined at the moment, but you can set up a pseudo rule, right? That says these users can do these administrative level things on these set of hosts. There's a bunch of different authentication mechanisms. There's SSO options. There's key options where you can use something like a YubiKey to authenticate your user. I think there's biometric options. There's all kinds of ways that you can authenticate users. My demo here is actually really simplistic. I'm going to switch over to a console. Means I got to switch my screen share. And then I'm going to just show you one of these users' accounts. So we're going to be using, let me look at my notes here. Let me show you how the host-based access stuff works. If we go over to groups here, the user groups we have here, we have a user group 1, right? We have a host, you have a user group 2 as well. And then underneath host groups, we have host group 1 and host group 2. People in user group 1 are also in host group 1, and people in user group 2 are also in host group 2. And we have two machines, two client machines. If you look under hosts here, we've got CLI1 and CLI2. CLI2 was misbehaving, so we're not going to use CLI2 in our demos today. This is an older deployment that I had set up, and something's wrong with that machine. But if we look at host groups for CLI1, you see it's in host group 1. And if we went back to, where was it, under host groups, we bring up host group 1 and look at HBAC, which is host-based access control rules. You can see user group 1 can access host group 1. Let me show you who's in user group 1, and that's the last thing I want to show you inside of the web UI here. So back to groups, back to user groups, back to user group 1. You can see the account Murph is in user group 1. So Murph should have access to CLI1. Let me switch that share now that I've shown you. Uh, Here we go. So that's the right, not sharing the wrong terminal window. Murph should have access to this machine. And I have local DNS set up so that these things work, but CLI1.idm0.lab, as you might know, that's not a normal domain name. I have local DNS for this stuff. And it'll ask me for her password. And again, if you have other authentication mechanisms set up, it will have you use those authentication mechanisms. I don't have shared home directories set up, and I didn't set it to create home directories when you log in. That's why I got this error here. But you can see here I am on CLI1, right? Now, you saw I didn't have any pseudo rules set up, so I can't show you anything really fancy, but there's user access. Now, you might remember Murph was the only person in that group. So if I tried one of the other accounts, like Butters, for example, I think the result here is that it rejects the password. No, it actually just drops me. It says, nope, you can't access this machine. That means that I put in his password correctly, but it didn't allow me access to the system. So there's a really quick and dirty demo of IDM. Are there any questions while we were here? It looks like you're answering some questions in chat.
Yeah, but I think it's worth calling out. So Shantanu asks, what feature is doing the users and groups on the final compute machine? So like,
All right,
is it LDAP that's doing the users and groups?
Free IPA / IDM use a conglomeration of different services to make this stuff work. The directory that is storing it is an LDAP directory. There's also a Kerberos domain that handles things like authentication tokens, and there's a few other things in the background, like runs its own DNS server, for example, so that you can run host DNS. The way I do that local DNS is I actually have a local caching name server that I use for things like ad filter, and I've delegated this idm0.lab domain over to the directory controller for that lab. Every time I register a host, it puts a DNS entry in there. So it's actually really slick that way. Very similar to what you'd expect in an Active Directory domain where it handles DNS.
That was it.
All right, cool.